Within Physicalism, what kind of culture does our metaphysics produce? Modern culture feels strangely unsettled. Across politics, psychology, technology, education, identity, and even our understanding of ourselves, something at a deeper level feels structurally unstable. Our public conversations have become increasingly polarized. Anxiety and loneliness continue to rise. Birth rates are falling across much of the developed world. Artificial intelligence is forcing us to rethink what it means to be human. Explanations are everywhere. Yet meaning often feels increasingly difficult to find. Most attempts to explain these changes begin in familiar places. We point towards economics, politics, technology, education, social media, housing, capitalism, psychology, and more. Each of these explanations contains genuine insight. None of these explanations should be dismissed, but I want to ask a different question, one that sits quietly beneath them all. What kind of culture does our metaphysics produce? For many people, the word metaphysics immediately brings to mind mysticism, crystals, or New Age spirituality. But that is not what this essay is about. Academic metaphysics is one of philosophy's oldest and most rigorous disciplines. It asks questions that science itself cannot answer. Not because science is inadequate, but because every scientific investigation already assumes some understanding of what reality fundamentally is. It may help to clarify that science is a method used to discover how the universe behaves. Metaphysics, however, asks what the universe actually is and explores the fundamental assumptions that make our scientific findings, such as space, time, and causality, possible in the first place. With that important distinction clarified, the next question becomes, how do metaphysical assumptions fit into our culture? To use a simple illustration, imagine someone wearing a pair of glasses. Most of the time they don't notice the glasses at all, they simply see the world. Metaphysical assumptions often work in much the same way. They become so familiar, so deeply woven into our civilization's institutions, education, science and culture that they gradually disappear from view. We stop noticing the assumptions themselves and instead experience the world through them. That invisibility may be precisely what gives metaphysics its greatest cultural influence. Before we continue, I want to clarify something. I am not suggesting that metaphysics is the only influence shaping a culture. This essay is not an argument that economics, psychology, biology, politics, or technology are unimportant. Each explains something real. Each describes an important room within the house of global civilization. My question concerns the house itself. Every culture, whether it realizes it or not, rests upon collectively accepted assumptions about the nature of reality. My question is simply this: what kind of culture does our dominant metaphysics produce? And if our metaphysics quietly shapes the way we understand ourselves, consciousness, knowledge, value, and even what counts as a legitimate explanation, then perhaps it shapes far more than we have ever stopped to notice. What is the dominant metaphysical framework? Before asking what kind of culture our metaphysics produces, we first need to ask a simpler question. What metaphysical assumptions does modern academic culture actually operate within? Although individual philosophers disagree profoundly about the nature of reality, modern research universities around the world share a remarkably similar methodological inheritance. Whether one studies neuroscience in London, physics in Tokyo, psychology in Boston, or biology in Sao Paulo, the underlying assumptions about what counts as legitimate scientific explanation are strikingly consistent. This does not mean that every academic individual personally believes the same metaphysical theory, nor does it mean that cultures have abandoned their own religious or philosophical traditions. India has Vedanta, Japan has Buddhism and Shinto, and the Islamic world possesses its own rich philosophical heritage. These traditions remain very much alive. Yet every academic institution, especially when connected across the globe, must decide what counts as evidence, what counts as explanation, and what kinds of questions are legitimate. These decisions are not themselves scientific discoveries, they are philosophical assumptions about how knowledge is obtained. However, within the academic institutions of modern science, a broadly physicalist or naturalistic framework has become the default language through which research is conducted. That is an important distinction. A scientist may privately hold almost any worldview, but the academic institution itself largely evaluates explanations according to whether they can be expressed in terms of physical processes, measurable interactions, and publicly observable evidence. Historically, this approach proved extraordinarily successful. It transformed medicine, it revolutionized engineering, it unlocked modern technology, it has allowed humanity to explore space itself. Its achievements are undeniable, yet success has consequences. Over time, a methodological commitment gradually began to resemble a metaphysical conclusion. Questions that lay outside this framework increasingly came to be viewed not merely as unanswered, but as somehow less legitimate. The distinction between "we cannot currently study this" and "this probably does not belong within reality" slowly became blurred. This matters because academia is not an isolated institution. Its influence extends far beyond university campuses, and the ideas developed within research institutions gradually find their way into classrooms, public policy, medicine, journalism, technology, law, and popular culture. They shape how future generations are educated, how governments understand social platforms, how healthcare is practiced, and even the accepted language through which we can describe ourselves. Academic ideas rarely remain within academia. Over time, they become culture. So if the dominant institutions through which a civilization understands reality within a particular metaphysical framework, it becomes reasonable to ask whether that framework leaves an imprint upon the wider culture itself. That question is what this essay explores. Research funding overwhelmingly favours projects that operate within established methodological assumptions. Young academics quickly discover that careers are built through incremental contributions to accepted paradigms. This is not usually the result of conspiracy or censorship, it is simply how institutions reduce risk. Public funding bodies are understandably cautious. Peer review rewards work that builds upon existing knowledge. Universities seek methodological reliability. Taken individually, each of these institutional decisions appears entirely reasonable. Collectively, however, they produce a powerful form of intellectual selection. Ideas that sit comfortably within the dominant framework receive greater institutional support than those that question the framework itself. The point is not that this process is malicious, nor that alternative metaphysical ideas are necessarily incorrect. Institutions naturally reward stability, continuity, and methodological reliability. The consequence, however, is cultural. Over time, the assumptions most consistently rewarded within academia become the assumptions that increasingly shape global education, public discourse, scientific practice, and our collective understanding of reality. A civilization need not consciously choose its metaphysics for that metaphysics to shape the civilization. Crucially, academic ideas rarely remain within academia. Charles Darwin transformed biology, Sigmund Freud reshaped psychology and popular culture, and Albert Einstein changed our understanding of space and time. Not forgetting the internet emerged from academic and military research before transforming everyday life decades later. In the end, ideas have consequences. A methodological question. Before we can ask what kind of culture our metaphysics produces, we first need to understand the dominant metaphysical framework that this essay will examine. Within contemporary academia, that framework is broadly physicalist. Understanding what physicalism is will allow us to distinguish the framework itself from the question this essay is actually asking. So, what is physicalism? Physicalism is the philosophical view that everything which exists is ultimately physical in nature. Consciousness, mind, thought, meaning, and emotion are therefore understood as arising entirely from physical processes. While different forms of physicalism disagree about the precise relationship between mind and brain, they share the conviction that no non-physical entities are required to explain reality. Importantly, this does not make physicalism anti-human, nor is it pseudo-scientific. It is one of the most influential philosophical positions in modern academia. As an example of physicalism's widespread support, the most widely recognized measure of contemporary philosophical opinion is the Phil Papers survey. It is regarded as the premier and most essential digital index in the field of academic philosophy, which polls thousands of professional philosophers worldwide. Across repeated surveys, physicalism has consistently emerged as the majority position within philosophy of mind, with over 50 to 60% of respondents explicitly identifying as physicalist, compared with much smaller minorities supporting dualist or idealist alternatives. For other examples, the influence of physicalism can also be seen in the kinds of explanations our institutions recognize as legitimate. Modern legal, medical, and scientific practice overwhelmingly seeks physical causes when explaining events, a commitment often associated with the principle known as the causal closure of the physical. As an example, if a plane crashes, a patient gets sick, a crime is committed, then our legal, medical, and scientific institutions only accept physical causes as valid explanations. Again, for an example, if an investigator or doctor suggested a non-physical metaphysical cause, like a spiritual disruption or an idealist manifestation of mind, they would be legally and professionally dismissed. The dominant metaphysics of a society can be revealed by what its courts and hospitals accept as truth. Now, whether physicalism is itself true is not a subject of this essay. The question here is different. Here it is asking whether a dominant metaphysical framework has cultural consequences. Notice that this question won't tell us whether physicalism itself is true, nor does it tell us whether idealism, dual aspect monism, Thomism, or any other metaphysical framework is true. That is an entirely different debate. The aim is not to evaluate competing metaphysical systems, but to explore the kinds of cultures they tend to produce when they become culturally dominant. The question I am asking, therefore, is much simpler. When a metaphysics becomes culturally dominant, what kind of culture would it likely produce? This raises an interesting question. Where is the best place to start looking? It might not be where you think. It is the modern global knowledge system. So universities, research institutions, medicine, science, law, and much of education, they all largely operate within a broadly physicalist or naturalistic metaphysical framework. Because the modern academic and scientific enterprise is now global, the metaphysical assumptions embedded within it are no longer confined to a single civilization. They increasingly shape the educational, legal, medical, technological, and scientific institutions of societies around the world. We can ask, what kinds of institutions should we expect to emerge globally from such a metaphysical framework? Suppose idealism became dominant. Would education look the same? Would psychology? Would medicine? Would law? And would artificial intelligence? The point is not to assume the answer. It is to recognize that no civilization or institution is metaphysically neutral. Every society, whether consciously or not, builds its institutions upon assumptions about what reality fundamentally is. Those assumptions eventually become so familiar that they cease to appear as assumptions at all. They become our cultural common sense. Like a pair of glasses worn every day, we stop noticing the lenses and simply experience the world through them. Perhaps the deepest influence of a dominant metaphysics is precisely because it has become invisible. If metaphysical assumptions can shape a civilization, the next question becomes obvious. Through what mechanism does that influence occur? How do abstract philosophical ideas become our normal everyday global culture? How metaphysics becomes culture. If metaphysical assumptions can shape global civilization, an obvious question follows. How? Metaphysical ideas do not become culture overnight, nor do they directly dictate how individuals think or behave. Rather, their influence is gradual, emerging through the institutions that produce, preserve, and transmit knowledge across generations. Education, science, medicine, law, journalism, public policy, and technology do not simply transmit information. They also establish what counts as legitimate knowledge, acceptable explanation, and reliable evidence. In doing so, they become the principal means through which the dominant metaphysical assumptions of a civilization are reproduced over time. The globally interconnected educational system becomes one of the principal means through which the dominant metaphysical framework is transmitted across cultures and reproduced over successive generations. As successive generations are educated within these institutional frameworks, the underlying assumptions become increasingly familiar. Eventually, they cease to appear as philosophical assumptions at all. They become both academic and social common sense. They become the air the culture breathes. This gradual process is what I refer to as epistemic institutionalization. The term describes how abstract metaphysical commitments become embedded within institutions before eventually finding expression in the everyday culture they help sustain. The process can be understood through four interconnected stages. The first is theoretical formulation, the second, institutional codification, the third, living the metaphysics, and the fourth is naturalized habitus. Exploring the first, theoretical formulation, the epistemic anchor. The process often begins during periods of severe civilizational or paradigm crisis. When an existing metaphysical framework begins to reveal important explanatory limitations, intellectuals formulate alternative models of reality. So, the mechanism. During the Enlightenment, thinkers like Descartes, Hobbes, and Newton sought to replace scholastic theology with a predictable framework to end sectarian conflict. The shift. They posited an ontology of mechanism, reducing the cosmos to deterministic, quantifiable matter. This shifted the foundational question of reality from divine purpose to mechanical causation. Over time, this metaphysical commitment came to be known as materialism, later broadened into what we now call physicalism. It was not itself a scientific discovery, but a philosophical assumption that shaped how scientific discoveries were interpreted. The second is institutional codification, or how institutions adopt a metaphysics. An abstract metaphysical framework begins to shape society when it becomes embedded within its institutions such as education, law, science, technology, and public administration. The techno-science. The mechanical ontology directly enabled the development of empirical science and industrial technologies. If nature is conceptually framed as fundamentally non-conscious and mechanically governed, it can be mathematically modelled, extracted, and manipulated without the same ethical or theological constraints that characterized earlier worldviews. Jurisprudence. Modern legal philosophy increasingly developed alongside conceptions of the individual that resonated with Cartesian understandings of the autonomous subject. These philosophical assumptions helped shape debates surrounding property, contracts, and individual rights, alongside many other historical influences. From this perspective, the law can be understood as codifying the metaphysical boundary between the autonomous human subject and the objective world. Education, the global transmission system. Institutional education acts as the primary transmission mechanism for the dominant ontology. By standardizing curricula globally, universities and schools help establish an epistemic hierarchy. As universities across the globe developed, increasing authority came to be granted to disciplines whose methods relied upon quantification, measurement, prediction, and physical explanation. Other disciplines continued to flourish, but they were increasingly understood as addressing questions of meaning, value, culture, and interpretation, rather than the physical structure of reality itself. By increasingly privileging physicalist methods as the primary criteria for objective knowledge within the natural sciences, the global education system tends to marginalize alternative metaphysical frameworks before students enter the professional workforce. Number 3. Living the metaphysics, the built environment. Once codified, the metaphysical framework is physically engineered into the civic landscape and its daily socio-economic routines. At this juncture, people begin living within the metaphysics, whether they consciously believe it or not. The built environment. Modern urban architecture and infrastructure are materializations of physicalist metaphysics. For example, transportation hubs, such as the regional rail infrastructure connecting different parts of the UK to London, are designed strictly around spatial optimization, linear timekeeping, and mechanical efficiency. Temporal discipline. The widespread adoption of standardized time becomes an essential condition for industrial coordination. Railway scheduling and large-scale economic organization. In this way, abstract concepts of measurable uniform time become embedded within everyday life. Number 4. Naturalized habitus. The epistemic default. The final stage occurs when the framework successfully becomes culturally dominant. The assumptions underlying the system become so deeply embedded that they transition from an argued philosophy to an unconscious habitus. The mechanism. Through intergenerational socialization, education systems, and daily institutional interaction, the dominant ontology is absorbed implicitly. The result: with the historical rise of scientific materialism, the framework loses its philosophical nomenclature. No longer identified as physicalism, it is instead misrecognized as objective reality or our common sense. At this point, the dominant metaphysics has become the very air our culture breathes. By the time a metaphysical framework becomes the air a culture breathes, it is no longer experienced as philosophy at all, it is simply experienced as reality. If that is true, then perhaps the most revealing place to study our metaphysics is not in philosophy departments, but in the culture we have built around it. This is where our journey continues in part 2.